The views and opinions expressed on the following program are those of the host and guests and do not necessarily represent those of any organization, including One Generation Away.
The freedom of a people to choose its leaders is the root of liberty.
Keep alive this experiment in liberty.
Liberty, in case you've forgotten, is the soul's right to breathe.
Government should be very minimal in protecting liberty.
Peace cannot be purchased at the cost of liberty.
The sturdy ground of liberty.
Liberty once lost is lost forever.
Fight for their liberty and for our security.
Guarantees individual liberty.
This great republic, born alone in liberty.
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 Liberty. Liberty.
Just how much do you want liberty?
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner, cutting through the double talk, taking on the topics, going after what the politicians really mean, and making it all clear. For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Why does the left hate not just conservatives and America, but themselves? Welcome back into Liberty Nation Radio. And this week we'll discuss how the left is intent on renouncing their own rights, and of course ours, and how their attempts to weaken constitutional protections reveals a deep-down rejection of their own heritage. We'll be joined by Mark Angelides, managing editor for LibertyNation.com. And LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor Scott Cosenza joins us for Talkin' Liberty.
Say what? Say what? Say what? One more time.
But we gotta start with Say What, featuring some of the most wacky, astonishing, and damnable things uttered by politicians and the chattering class on the events and issues of the day. And if you want to know what the left is all about, just look at their deification of one David Hogg, the high school senior from Stoneman Douglas High School, who's been treated as the conscience, the voice of the gun control movement, his qualification being that he was in the school when the shooting occurred. Laura Ingraham on Fox News had the audacity to tweet out that Hogg had been rejected by 4 different colleges and then was forced to apologize when young Mr. Hogg did what the left does so well, went after Ingram's sponsors. Typical of the establishment media was this exchange on CNN with a fawning Allison Camerata asking Hogg if he accepts Ingram's apology.
No, she's only apologizing after a third of her advertisers pulled out. And I think it's really disgusting, the fact that she basically tried promoting her show after apologizing to me. I want people to understand, we're not trying to take your guns. We're not against the Second Amendment. We don't want to repeal the Second Amendment.
David, I am stunned that 4 colleges rejected you. What kind of dumbass colleges don't want you? I mean, you've taken the country by storm.
Yes, indeed, David Hogg is Allison Camerata's hero. And he's the perfect front man for the left, a young anti-gun atheist on a crusade to destroy Fox News. Meanwhile, President Trump deals with that caravan of Central Americans on their annual trek to cross the U.S. southern border, Trump ordering the employment of 4,000 National Guard troops as he pressures Mexico to stop the caravan short of the border. And the Mexican ambassador to the U.S., Geronimo Gutierrez, uttered the same mantra over and over in an interview with Fox News.
Mexico's migration policy is to seek that any migration is legal, safe, orderly, in a way, again, that it's legal, safe, and orderly. We do work to assure that migration is legal, safe, and orderly. So it is in our own best interest to assure that migration is safe, legally, and ordered. So we understand this very clearly.
I'm thinking that they want their migration to be legal, safe, and orderly. But the left has again unmasked themselves, this time on open borders, with one open borders activist, Enrique Moronis, telling Tucker Carlson that the U.S. does not have the moral standing to prevent illegal immigrants from flowing over the border.
The fact that these people are coming from Central America is the same thing that's been going on since Reagan interfered in the Central American policies in the late 70s and 80s. The United States interfering in these countries, the demand for the drugs, invading a sovereign land like Iraq, or interfering in the civil wars of Central America, that causes people to flee. Have you heard of Iran-Contra? Have you heard of the fact that the United States is the number one consumer of natural resources from other countries? And when they invade sovereign lands, when they take from sovereign lands, they should be a more welcoming nation, and they are not.
Okay, well, that settles the issue. These illegals flowing across the border should be let in because, as always, it's America's fault they're fleeing their countries to begin with. But back on the home front, the president has had a bee in his bonnet, that's the old-time expression, about Amazon, talking them down on 4 separate occasions in recent days.
The post office is losing billions of dollars, and the taxpayers are paying for that money because it delivers packages for Amazon at a very below cost. And that's not fair to the United States. It's not fair to our taxpayers. And Amazon has the money to pay the fair rate at the post office, which would be much more than they're paying right now.
So why exactly is Trump going after Amazon? Well, as Stuart Varney said on Fox Business Network, while Amazon has swallowed up a lot of retail businesses and has enjoyed big discounts with the U.S. Postal Service, it likely has everything to do with Amazon's big cheese.
Maybe there's one more reason for the president's attacks. Amazon's founder, Jeff Bezos. He owns the Washington Post, and if you have ever read that newspaper in the last 2 years, you would know that it is the most virulent of all the Trump attack machines out there. The Post attacks the president in personal terms, questioning his sanity, his intelligence, his integrity, and his character. Maybe the president takes it personally. Maybe that's why he's gone after Amazon.
I don't think that's a maybe. That's a definite. The president's beatdown on Amazon did cause their stock to fall rather precipitously. But there was also a scandal continuing to unfold on Capitol Hill with word that 44 Democrat representatives failed to do background checks before hiring members of the disgraced Imran Awan and his family as IT technicians. They're now suspected of unauthorized access to privileged government data. And as stated by the Daily Caller's Luke Rosiak, a guest on our show a few weeks back, the report released by the IG, the Inspector General, reveals that these 44 Democrats were grossly negligent.
The House policy actually says that background checks are required, but if you delve into the fine print, there's technically a loophole that these members may have been able to invoke that essentially allowed another member just to vouch for them. So it was as casual as that before you turn over the passwords that give these guys access to all the emails of these members of Congress and every file on their hard drives and all their staffers' hard drives. And if they would have run this background check, it would have found out not only multiple criminal convictions, but $1 million bankruptcy, a dozen lawsuits, a lot of them about fraud. It would have found a whole host of major red flags. And the Democrats didn't do any of those checks. As a result, they gave these guys access to everything. And the IG determined that they were funneling data off the House network in really suspicious ways.
Of course, these Democrats felt it would be unacceptable to actually do background checks given the heritage of Imran Awan. Debbie Wasserman Schultz refused to apologize for hiring Awan and keeping him around, saying, "You have to stand up for what's right," whatever that means. Exhausted by all the fake news, tired with the spin rooms, at Liberty Nation, our aim is to bring you the facts first. The Media Bias Watch site has ranked Liberty Nation very high for factual content. So, for more news and analysis without the propaganda, click onto our website at libertynation.com. Sign up for the daily briefing on the home page to get your refreshing daily dose of reality. Quick break, and then we're back to talk about self-loathing on the left.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
What we have heard here today has been a political spectacle.
We elect these guys to run the country. They're just not doing their job.
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Well, now that former Supreme Court Justice John Paul Stevens has unmasked the true intentions of the hard left regarding guns to repeal the Second Amendment, it begs a very troubling question. How can it be that America's youth, spurred on to participate in mass gun control demonstrations by their leftist handlers, is actually demanding the removal of their own rights? Sure, those kids who've been making a spectacle of themselves, organized and financed by Oprah and George Clooney and George Soros, say they only want common sense gun control. But of course, that's what they're supposed to say. Why? Because if, like Justice Stevens, the organizers revealed their true intentions, the public would turn on them. It's like so many other issues where, but for a left lockstep media, the mask would be pulled off those who view America as a nation defined by racism, sexism, and multiple additional phobias, and who consequently seek to reverse this curse through government control of virtually every area of our lives from cradle to grave. Now, certainly the left's contempt for their own rights and ours is hardly limited to the Second Amendment. They increasingly threaten the First Amendment. You know, the one that allows people to speak in public without fear of arrest. Free speech is undeniably under assault on college campuses from coast to coast, surveys revealing a disturbing trend of restricting unwelcome or politically incorrect speech and labeling it as violence, a pretext for declaring it unlawful. So here's a question. Is there a single historical precedent for a people insisting on the specific renunciation of their own rights, ones that are so central to their own freedom and which were won at such a great cost of blood and treasure? And the answer is no. There most decidedly is not a precedent for that. Tyrants don't promise to take away rights. They simply abolish them once they assume power. But demanding to have your own rights eliminated is an entirely different matter. The hundreds of millions of people around the world who are living under despotism would do almost anything to secure these rights, to speak freely and defend themselves. They understand, as Mao Zedong once said, that all political power comes from the barrel of a gun. That's why so many of them seek to move here to the U.S. But it seems impressionable young Americans are being instructed by the left to hate what America represents, including themselves. They're taught to be ashamed of any privileges which might have accrued to them by birth, and to renounce the very values and culture and freedoms that allow them, through none of their own effort, to live in the most free and prosperous nation in the history of civilization. This trend is beyond disturbing. Now, we know how conservatives have been silenced on the college campus, but this growing contempt for constitutional rights extends well beyond the academy. During the 2016 presidential campaign, Donald Trump was forced to cancel a campaign event in Chicago, and he had several others placed in jeopardy, because of orchestrated violence and threats leveled against Trump supporters exercising their right to speech and assembly. Demonstrators at the Women's March right after Trump's inauguration were treated to virtue-signaling anti-American celebrities, one of whom actually said, this is Madonna, that she considered burning down the White House because she refused to accept the results of the election. Calls for removing Trump began the day after he was elected and continue unabated for, as the lawyers like to say, any reason or no reason. In provoking the most bitter political divide in generations, the institutional and activist left have not needed the right to point out their naked desire for power at all costs. Like Justice Stevens, they have unmasked themselves. They've unleashed their most radical inclinations by attempting to overturn the results of a free election. And they have done so by fully implementing Saul Alinsky's rules for radicals. Now, if throwing a kitchen sink worth of scurrilous and fabricated charges against Donald Trump is not a certain sign of a totalitarian mindset, then nothing is. Now, we saw nuanced hints of this, and some obviously not so nuanced, during the Obama years. The 44th president and his cohorts watered down the freedom of religion embedded in the First Amendment by consistently referring to it as freedom of worship. The underlying message being that while the government will not try to enter churches and shut down worship services, if you try to extend that religious freedom to the public square, all bets are off and you're on your own. As tens of millions of Americans were set to keep a bit more of their own money after the tax reform bill was passed, Nancy Pelosi clearly implied that only the greedy would celebrate this legislation, which she called Armageddon. This was entirely consistent with the leftist view that if you believe you're entitled to enjoy just a touch more of the fruits of your own labor, or, God forbid, you oppose the government continuing the most confiscatory tax rate on businesses in the free world, you deserve to be condemned. You should instead willingly pay more taxes to a demonstrably dysfunctional government and demand that your constitutional right to self-defense be overturned. As jobs abound, businesses thrive, and the economy grows at a rate well above and beyond the Obama years, leftists refuse to even acknowledge this unmistakable upturn, treating it as a foreboding sign of a more vibrant free market, and we can't have that now, can we? When Barack Obama dismissed American know-how and determination by telling business owners that they didn't build their own entrepreneurial enterprises, that they would never have succeeded without the government, it sent an unambiguous message that prosperity is to be subsumed by central state authority. An extension of the left's self-loathing is their view of the proper role of America in the world, in what Obama called, oxymoronically, leading from behind. They wish to renounce American sovereignty, virtue, and strength. You know, the kind we displayed in vanquishing the evils of Nazism and fascism and Soviet communism. Instead, the left desires to fall into the waiting arms of a global world order, ceding authority to the United Nations, the Paris Climate Accord, the World Trade Organization, etc., all of which seek to render the U.S. increasingly indistinguishable from the other 200 nations of the world. Teaching young Americans to be ashamed of themselves and their country stands to create a generation of self-loathing Americans prepared to willingly, even enthusiastically, forfeit the rights with which they were blessed. They're being manipulated by leftists who have proven they will not surrender in their ceaseless quest to deconstruct the very foundations of our country and roll back the liberties which define what Ronald Reagan once called the last best hope of man. But self-hatred is not limited to the United States of America. We'll talk about the view from the left in Europe with LibertyNation.com managing editor Mark Angelides when we return.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
What we have heard here today has been a political spectacle.
We elect these guys to run the country. They're just not doing their job.
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Well, we just discussed how the American left hates not just conservatives and America itself, or what it's traditionally been, but themselves, evidenced by their determination to deconstruct the culture from whence they came, to achieve what Barack Obama promised, the fundamental transformation of America. And just what do they want this transformed America to look like? Well, if we look to our east across the pond, we find the answer in a globalist order trying to fend off nationalist challenges in England, Italy, and elsewhere. And we bring in LibertyNation.com managing editor Mark Angelides now to analyze the view from the left in Europe. Welcome, Mark.
Hi, Tim. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. You know, Mark, you can see the stark contrast between the left and the right in the last two U.S. presidential elections. Conservatives believed it vital to the future of the country that Barack Obama be defeated by Mitt Romney in 2012, and they were in despair when Obama was reelected. They really were, but they did not challenge the legitimacy of the outcome or try to throw the kitchen sink at Obama or try to impeach him. But in 2016, we had the reverse, with the left declaring the election of Donald Trump as the end of the world as we know it. They started calling for his impeachment the day after he was elected. And they've now done everything to not just overturn the election, but to double down on their deconstruction of the things that have always defined America and thus themselves. Do I have this right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's not just an American issue. It's a worldwide issue. Well, let's say a Western worldwide issue that focuses specifically on the things that hold society together. The family unit being a huge one. The idea of pride in your nation, pride in your community. It's a worldwide issue.
Well, no question about it, and it seems that the manifestation of self-loathing amongst the European left is the extent to which the EU employs an iron fist in enforcing politically correct solutions on their member states designed not to protect, but diminish the distinct cultures that have made these individual countries what they are.
Yeah, that's really so very true. I mean, it's to the point where over the London City Hall with London Mayor Sadiq Khan, that they're flying the European flag. When Angela Merkel, not in the most recent elections, but in the last ones when she won, one of her cabinet members was waving a German flag, and she strode over to him, ripped it out of his hands, and threw it away. That's almost as though they're ashamed of their nations, of our nations. It's there's a series of laws in place that mean that we cannot distinguish for work purposes, for preferential purposes, people from our own country as opposed to people from other countries. The full force of the law, the European law, which is now supreme in the UK, hopefully not for much longer, but the full force of the European law is brought to weight against the nations, against their own interests. And it's a very, very sad day where, I mean, Europe is has such a rich cultural history with so many different people with different languages and different customs and ideas.
Indeed.
And they're all being forced to fit into one size fits all.
Mm-hmm.
And it's an utter disgrace. Also, they can sell more Starbucks coffee.
Well, they are succeeding to that extent, aren't they?
They are.
Let's talk a little bit about German Chancellor Angela Merkel, or Angela Merkel, if you want to sound sophisticated. She has been the sort of de facto leader of the European Union over these last years. So let me ask you, what exactly was Angela Merkel thinking when she accepted almost 2 million refugees, primarily from Syria, seeming not to understand how this influx of Muslims would fundamentally change Germany? It was as if she didn't believe enough in her own country and culture to place reasonable restrictions on the flood of refugees.
Yeah. Well, to be honest, I think that they grossly underestimated what was going to happen. When Angela Merkel, with the help of the EU Commission, they decided to redefine what makes a refugee. So previously, as is still the same in your country as in mine, it's an international standard that says, you've got to be either fleeing war or terror, and you've got to stop in the first safe country, which is where you should declare yourself for asylum. But they changed that, and they said anybody who's fleeing poverty. So what that did was
that's a pretty broad classification. People fleeing poverty.
Yeah. So basically, it means anybody who is less well off than the country in which they want to travel to has an automatic right to claim asylum, or refugee status at least. And so what happened was people started coming in, and when we were looking up, I mean, not me personally, because I'm quite a cynic at the best of times, but most people were looking on, think, wow, there's a lot of Syrians getting out of there. Well done to them for making a break for freedom. But then they realized that hardly any of them are actually percentage-wise. It's not just Syrians; it's everybody from basically countries that are financially poorer. And so they're literally flooding in. People are dying on boats coming over. And I mean, I know the phrase "the blood is on their hands" is one that's being much used today, especially in relation to all the things happening in America. But when you tell people that you can come here, you'll be granted refugee status simply from being from a poorer country, and people get on the boat, these unfit boats with people smugglers who essentially want to sink the boat so they can't be traced back. The blood is on their hands with this. The people who've died on the boats crossing, it's terrible. But what Merkel did then is, instead of saying, this is enough, we've got too many people here, she carried on and carried on. Now, she did say at one point a little while ago that this was possibly a mistake. She said, "Oh, maybe I've made a huge mistake."
You think?
Yeah, she said this, but then this was coming up to an election, and it was the exact election in which the Alternative for Deutschland, the AfD, won 93 seats.
The most that a nationalist, so-called nationalist party has won since the end of World War II.
Absolutely. So you have to wonder, was she thinking, if I say these words, will I get slightly more votes? And I think the answer we're looking at here is quite a clear yes. She said that it was a mistake purely for votes. I mean, many years ago, she even said that, multiculturalism, it was a big mistake. She's even said this herself. This was years ago, and then proceeded to say, "Come one, come all." So I believe any words from her mouth that even smack of a touch of reality are for pure election-winning purposes.
Thank you for joining us, Mark. Appreciate it. Mark Angelides, managing editor for LibertyNation.com, joining us from London. Exhausted by all the fake news? Tired with the spin rooms? At Liberty Nation, our aim is to bring you the facts first. The Media Bias Watch site has ranked Liberty Nation very high for factual content. So, for more news and analysis without the propaganda, click on our website at LibertyNation.com. Sign up for our daily briefing on the home page to get your refreshing daily dose of reality. We will break away, then come back for Talkin' Liberty with LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor Scott Cosenza.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
And now it is time for the segment of Liberty Nation which we entitle Talkin' Liberty, as we drill down on the threats and promising developments regarding your liberty with our regular contributor and constitutional lawyer, LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor Scott Cosenza. Hello, Scott.
Hello, Tim.
Congratulations on Villanova, by the way.
Well, thank you, sir.
Where you attended law school.
Indeed.
What a team. What a tournament. It was remarkable.
And the class of 99 law school had a lot to do with their success.
Absolutely. I was just going to say that. You beat me to it. Right. But in the way of looking forward to future presidential elections, we can look just in the recent past and see how significant Florida has been. Going back to 2000, when, of course, it was the state of Florida which gave George W. Bush a 530 538 vote victory in a state of 20 million people and handed him the presidential election. It's always been a critical state. And now there's the question of felon voting rights, which could, in your view and probably the view of others, have a significant impact on future presidential elections.
Yes, Tim, so Florida strips all felons, and we've talked about this at least once before on the show, that Florida strips all felons of voting rights, which is a pretty drastic move compared to the treatment that felons get in other states. And this is all felons. And so when we think about all the things that are felonies in Florida, that encompasses many, for instance, drug crimes that are just simple possession, all sorts of things that we might not think are felonies if we don't, kind of drill down into it. But currently the process is you have to serve your entire sentence and probation and make restitution, and all of that has to be done. Then 5 years has to elapse before you can apply for your voting rights to be restored. So that's a pretty high burden. And then once you apply for those voting rights to be restored, that appeal is heard before a clemency board appointed solely by Governor Rick Scott, and then that board makes a recommendation, and Rick Scott has sole discretion on whether or not he takes that recommendation. So they sued, claiming that this is a violation of the First and 14th Amendment and their constitutional rights. U.S. District Judge Mark Walker made a ruling that was correct, that this treatment of felons in Florida regarding their voting rights is violative of multiple constitutional rights that they held, and Florida needed to stop doing so immediately. Florida appealed the decision and asked Judge Mark Walker to hold his order in abeyance until the district or the appeals court ruled on it. And that's commonly done when a large change is ordered by a district court judge. They say, well, all right, let's put the brakes on this until we get a ruling from, we all know that this is going to be appealed. Well, anyway, he wrote a blistering decision, Tim, lighting up the Rick Scott administration and the government of Florida for dragging their feet on this matter, and has said he absolutely will not put his decision in abeyance, that they better get a system. They have 30 days to get a system that doesn't infringe and violate on these felons' voting rights, and that's it.
And of course, the assumption is always that these felons who would secure voting rights would not exactly vote for the Republicans. Let's put it that way.
The assumption certainly is, I think, from all sides, that they are going to be largely a pro-Democrat voting bloc, to be sure.
How many felons are we talking about here whose voting rights could be in play?
Oh, at least hundreds of thousands, at least. Currently, there's a 10,000-person backlog just to have their hearings heard before that clemency board. Those are people who are interested enough to actually go through that formalized process.
I'm surprised that the idea of granting voting rights to felons is not a federal matter. Having your right to vote. The right to vote is a federal matter, so it's somewhat surprising. I'm not saying it's wrong or right, but it's somewhat surprising that it's not a strictly federal issue as to when someone can resecure their right to vote.
Well, it was a federal court that made this judgment. But it's the state elections. It is part of our federal system, right? It's a federal system. So there are state components and federal components. But this was a federal judge ruling that the federal constitutional rights of the complainants was not.
So what that will ultimately mean is if it goes, let's say, all the way to the Supreme Court and felons are granted voting rights again after paying their debt to society, it will then render null and void all other state laws that control whether felons would have the right to vote. This came up in Virginia in the last election when Terry McAuliffe, the governor, granted a blanket pardon, restoring their voting rights, and then it went to a judge who said he had to do it individually, which he did with a auto pen.
Right.
Okay. Well, it's this. Well, we need to follow this closely because, of course, Florida could be again a pivotal state in the 2020
I just thought it was refreshing.
Election.
I mean, I think the political angle is interesting, as I said to you, but I also think that the speed with which this judge has ordered this blatant constitutional violation to be corrected is actually refreshing. And if you think about it, instead of the political angle, which I know that is your first sort of
well, I think the constitutional angle is very interesting, though. That's why I said I'm surprised that it is not already a federal matter and that states are permitted to make their own rules.
I'd like to see more direction from judges, not just with things necessarily that benefit the Democrat politicians, but there are many areas in the law that we could use this kind of adamant enforcement of constitutional rights.
Constitution comes first, regardless of political considerations. Well, Scott Pruitt, the EPA director, cabinet level position, he has become probably the chief target in the Trump administration outside of the president himself because the left believes that they own the Environmental Protection Agency, that free market people and those who don't buy into the climate change agenda should essentially not be permitted to run the department. But now Scott Pruitt has decided to nix the EPA secret science. What does that mean?
Well, firstly, I'll say that Betsy DeVos might have a bone to pick with your
well, that's true.
Contention.
Betsy DeVos might be 1 and 1A as a target in that administration.
So this is an interesting story, and people can read more about it on LibertyNation.com. Our contributor, John Washington, wrote an interesting piece on it, and it discusses how the EPA under Pruitt is stopping what they call secret science. So this comes from a case where the EPA drafted rules, and now these rules are very consequential. They're existentially consequential for many people. If you work in a factory that emits certain pollutants, if they change a rule that closes your factory down and you lose your job, you can imagine that's a pretty big deal to you, right? So it was the parts per million of this certain pollutant that they were regulating and writing rules about. But they had the studies that they relied on used data sets that were secret and unavailable. And all these groups are saying, we need to be able to challenge, take a look at this data and see if it actually justifies your conclusions or not. And the EPA is like, oh, no, you can't look at that. And they had the cover for their denying this disclosure was that it would violate the medical records or people who were participants in the various studies. Now, one thing we learn about is there are ways to strip out the personally identifying, records, right? Like whether it's some metadata that you can still then look at and challenge the data. And that's what the EPA has done. And you are right, Tim. There is a gnashing of teeth. And I mean, there was an op-ed in the New York Times challenging this.
Because this is all settled science, right. Scott. Settled science.
Well, the funny thing is they use the language that they use is that it's anti-science, that this new EPA thing is anti-science. But one thing that we know is that being able to attack the data, okay, and attack the assumptions made in a study is the basics of science. If we can't have a robust debate about the test itself, that's not science. So I think that this is a good thing that people who have, they're going to tell you you're going to close your factory down. Well, why? Well, you can't see why. Is that liberty? I don't think so. That doesn't seem to me to be consistent with notions of good governance. So I think this is a good move.
Thank you, Scott.
Thanks, Tim.
This program, Liberty Nation Radio, plus LibertyNation.com's own podcast, The Uprising, are available to you on demand at LibertyNation.com and, of course, from fine podcast providers everywhere. So that is it for this week, but we will be back at you next week. Same time, same station, as they used to say. Until then, this is Tim Donner saying, stand up for liberty. And we'll see you next time on Liberty Nation.